circulation, it follows certain circulatory pathways. Circulatory pathways. So that means organisms usually follow different type of circulatory pathways. So there are two categories of circulatory pathways. One, open circulatory system, and B, closed circulatory system. Open circulatory system and closed circulatory system. So what is the difference between the circulatory pathway, which is usually called as open, and closed? So in case of open circulatory system, it consists of heart, a pumping organ. It consists of arteries and veins, but there is an absence of connecting, that is called as capillaries, between veins as well as arteries. That means it is incomplete, where the blood flows into the hemocoel or to the coelom cavity, where the organs of the body or the cells of the body bath without supply of blood directly through the help of capillaries. That's the reason why it is called as open circulatory system. So this open circulatory system can be seen in the group of animals called as arthropods, mollusca excluding cephalopods, so easy to remember, C is for cephalopods and it has closed circulatory system. We can see it in hemipodata, etc. When it comes to the closed circulatory system, it has all the three basic components of blood circulatory system, that is called as blood, heart, and blood vessels with arteries, veins, and connecting vessels. Called as capillaries. That means the capillaries directly supply the blood to each and every cell of the body. That's the reason why it is called as closed circulatory system, and we can see mostly in cephalopods. We can find in mostly vertebrates. You can find this such kind of circulatory system. Clear? Okay. When we go with this circulation, we can see that heart, if it is body parts, and it is lungs, we can see that the heart is receiving the deoxygenated blood from the body parts, and this deoxygenated blood is sent to the lungs for oxygenation. After oxygenation, the oxygenated blood is sent to the heart, and this oxygenated blood is sent to the body parts. It is deoxygenated, whereas here it is oxygenated. Here we can see that there is a complete separation of impure blood as well as pure blood. If you go with the right side of the heart, it is usually have deoxygenated blood, whereas in the left side we have completely oxygenated blood. But here also we can see that the heart which sends the deoxygenated blood to the lungs, after oxygenation it is sent to the heart again. And this particular heart is usually called as pulmonary heart. Pulmonary heart with pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary heart with pulmonary circulation. What do you mean by pulmonary heart with pulmonary circulation? The circulation that is taking place between the heart and the lungs for oxygenation of deoxygenated blood is usually called as pulmonary circulation, and such a combination is usually called as pulmonary heart. Whereas once the deoxygenated blood reaches to the body parts, after utilization of this oxygenation, these body parts will release the deoxygenated blood again to the heart. You can see that a different circulation arises between heart and the body parts. So such a circulation that is taking place between the heart and the body parts is usually called as systematic circulation. And such an art is usually called as systematic heart. Systematic heart. So circulation between the heart and the body parts is usually called as systematic circulation, and the heart is usually represented as systematic heart. And the circulation that is taking place between heart and the lungs, that is within this lungs and the heart, is usually called as pulmonary circulation, and the heart is usually called as pulmonary heart. That means collectively, for having one complete circulation, it has to perform two circulations. What is that? One, systematic circulation between the heart and the body parts, and second one is a pulmonary circulation that is taking place between heart and the lungs. So such a circulation is usually called as double circulation, but which is missing in case of single circulation, which is taking place in the fishes. So when we go with the third component, so the heart, which is a pumping organ, usually helps in circulation of blood. So how it takes place in case of human being is our present topic to be discussed. So usually, as I mentioned you earlier, that the impure or deoxygenated blood from various parts of the body is sent to the heart. But how it is processed, how the processing takes place, where the deoxygenated blood from the heart reaches to the lungs, and how it is again sent to the heart after oxygenation, and how this oxygenated blood moves to various parts of the body. So we will discuss in circulation of blood in the heart. So let us see. Okay. This is the heart. Let us think this is the lungs, and these are the body organs or body parts or tissues, what we call it as. So as I mentioned you, usually the deoxygenated blood from the body parts is poured into the right chamber. So the right side is for deoxygenated blood, whereas the left side, this is the right side, whereas the left side is for oxygenated blood. So always remember, left side oxygenated, right side deoxygenated. So the blood from the body parts is usually received by a set of veins, a larger veins that are usually called as caval veins. Caval veins. So the impure blood from various parts of the body is poured into the heart, particularly right chamber, through caval veins, and through the systematic circulation, whatever the circulation that is taking place through the systematic circulation, the impure blood is poured into the right chamber of the atrium through caval veins, and there are two types of caval veins which usually brings the impure blood from the lower part of the body and upper part of the body. From the lower part of the body, the caval veins bring impure blood called as inferior vena cavas. Inferior vena cava usually bring the impure blood from the lower part of the body through systematic circulation. Above to the heart, it brings upper parts of the body, above to the heart region, the impure blood from various parts of body through systematic circulation, usually brought by superior vena cava. So which are collectively called as caval veins. The lower side, inferior vena cava, which are inferior vena cavas, and from the superior vena cava in the upper part of the body, bring the impure blood through which is collectively called as caval veins, and pour into the right chamber. Okay, as I mentioned you that an opening is present at this particular junction in the middle, upper middle portion, where this caval veins pour their secretion, that means pour their blood, impure blood, deoxygenated blood into the right chamber, right auricular chamber. This is right auricular chamber. Okay. So along with this right auricular, along with this caval veins, there is inferior vena cava and superior vena cava. As I mentioned, the coronary veins also pour their secretion into this right auricular chamber. So during this period of time, the oxygenated blood, this is actually from the body parts. The oxygenated blood from the lungs is poured into the left auricular chamber. So during this process of pouring the blood into the auricular chambers, the heart is usually in a diastolic state, that is a resting state. It usually takes place in the resting state. In the resting state, the impure blood from the body parts or the tissues is poured into the right auricular chamber, whereas the oxygenated blood from the lungs through pulmonary veins get poured into the left auricular chamber. During this process, around 70% 70% of blood enters freely into the ventricles. Enters freely into the ventricles. Make it clear, when the heart is in a resting state, the deoxygenated blood from the tissues, oxygenated blood from the lungs is poured into the upper chambers, which are usually called as receiving chambers. The impure blood is poured into the right auricular chamber by two openings. One, caval veins, the opening that arises through caval veins, and the opening that arises through coronary veins. At the same time, the lungs, after oxygenation, through pulmonary, this is usually called as pulmonary vein. This pulmonary vein pour their blood, oxygenated blood segregation into left auricular chamber, and this is called as systematic or caval veins. What we call it as caval veins, as well as coronary veins. The impure blood or deoxygenated blood get poured into the right auricular chamber. So this all takes place at resting state, in resting state only. In the resting state, the impure blood usually pour into the right auricular chamber through caval veins and coronary veins, whereas from the lungs after oxygenation through pulmonary vein, in the resting state, it fills the left auricular chamber. So, I mentioned that during this process, the blood usually flows, around 70% of the blood usually flows into the chamber, into the lower chambers, that is called as ventricles, without any pressure or anything. Once these two chambers, the upper chamber, receiving chambers or auricular chambers get filled up, the nodal tissue that is present at the right side of the right auricular chamber, which is usually called as SAN, sinoauricular node, or also called as pacemaker. Why it is called as pacemaker? Because it is auto-excitable. It doesn't receive any kind of nervous signal for getting ignited. And this creates an action potential which usually helps in contraction of the arterial chambers as well as ventricular chambers. That's the reason why it is usually called as a pacemaker. And such hearts which doesn't have any ignition from the neural system to contract and to relax, they are usually called as myogenic hearts. Myogenic hearts. So almost all the organisms that come under phylum Chordata, Echinodermata, as well as mollusca have myogenic hearts. Whereas organisms, in case of arthropods, the hearts usually function with the stimulus that is created by the nervous system or neural system. That's the reason why they are usually called as neurogenic hearts. Okay, so myogenic hearts are auto-excitable. Auto-excitable. So they can be excited within themselves with a special tissue that is called as nodal tissue. And the nodal tissue that is present at the uppermost rightmost part of the right ventricle is usually called a SAN or pacemaker, because it creates an action potential, and this action potential passes to another nodal tissue that is present at the left portion of the right ventricle, which is usually called as AV node. AV node. From this AV node, this action potential enters through bundle of muscles that are present in the walls of these ventricles, which is usually called as AV bundles, and this bundles just bifurcate to give rise to muscular fibers attaching to the walls of the ventricles called as Purkinje fibers. And this bundles of auriculoventriculars as well as Purkinje fibers are collectively called as bundle of His. Okay? So once in the resting state, the two chambers receives the blood, the oxygenated blood from the lungs and deoxygenated blood from the body parts. The sinoauricular node or pacemaker, which is an auto-excitable nodal tissue, just create an excitation which pass an action potential in the auricles, which leads to contraction, which helps in contracting. And this action potential, when it reaches to the auriculoventricular node, this is AV node, what we call it as AV node. This AV node receives the action potential and makes a possibility of sending this action potential to the ventricles through with the help of AV bundles, Purkinje fibers, that is usually called as bundle of His. Okay, and this creates the contraction of ventricles, and when contraction of the ventricles takes place, the impure blood that is present in right ventricle is supplied to the lungs for oxygenation. During contraction of the ventricles, what happened? The impure blood from the right ventricle, with the help of pulmonary arteries, they carry it to the lungs for oxygenation. At the same time, with the help of the largest artery, that is called as aorta, what we call it as aorta or aortic arcs, the blood is transported, the pure blood from left ventricle is transported to various body parts. Okay. So now, once the pure blood is transported to the body parts and impure blood from the right ventricle is transported to the lungs, tissues utilize this oxygenated blood, and after utilizing it, it is again the deoxygenated blood is formed and the cycle continues. Okay, between the systematic circulation and pulmonary circulation. Okay. So during this process of circulation of the blood, certain sounds are usually formed. Clear? So once, what we call it as, we will discuss that in a cardiac cycle. So in cardiac cycle, we have two So during the circulation, we can see that the impure blood or deoxygenated blood with the help of caval veins and coronary veins pour the secretion into the right atrium. So once it pours into the right atrium, we can see that the blood, around 70% of the blood enters into right ventricle or 70% or left ventricle. Oxygenated blood from pulmonary veins and deoxygenated blood from caval and coronary veins enter into the heart upper chambers. They enter into the upper chambers, which are called as arterial chambers. Around 75% of the blood enters into the right ventricle and left ventricle. At this juncture, once the filling of blood takes place, the arterial contraction takes place, and once the arterial contraction takes place, around 30% of blood enters into right ventricle and left ventricle. Right and left ventricle. So the arterial contraction creates an action potential from the sinoauricular node. Once the blood enters through the right and left valves, that is called as bicuspid valves and tricuspid valves. The tricuspid and bicuspid valves allow the blood to flow from upper chambers to lower chambers. Once the blood enters into the right ventricle and left ventricle, the ventricular contraction takes place. Ventricular contraction takes place. During this ventricular contraction, at the starting of this ventricular contraction, bicuspid valves and tricuspid valves close, creating first sound of heart called as love. Okay, so once the ventricular contraction takes place, at the starting, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves get closed up and creating the first sound that is in the heart, that is called as love. Clear? So blood from the ventricular chambers through the aortic branch and through the pulmonary arteries, the pure and impure blood passes to the body parts and the lungs respectively. So the ventricles usually collectively, the arterial chambers and ventricular chambers contract, and when this contraction takes place, the heart comes to rest. That is once the ventricular contraction completes, the heart comes to a resting position. Okay. So once the heart comes to the resting position, the semilunar valves get closed up. The semilunar valves are nothing but the valves that are present in the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary arteries and the aortic arch, which is usually called as semilunar. Okay, in the resting position, semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are present in the pulmonary artery and aortic branches. Aortic branch. So this semilunar valve closes, which creates second sound called as duck. So due to the closure of semilunar valves, before entering into the resting position, is usually called as created by the closing of semilunar valves, that is called as second sound, that is called as duck. So closing of bicuspid and tricuspid valves is usually called as first sound, which is called as lup and duck. So once again the resting position takes place, 70% of the blood enters into the first of all right auricle and left auricle, and from right auricle and left auricle the blood flows into the right ventricle and left ventricle, and arterial contraction takes place. Again 30% of the blood enters into the right ventricle and left ventricle, and now the ventricular contraction takes place, which is created by the action potential from the auriculoventricular node, and once the contraction starts, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves get closed, creating the first sound of the heart, that is called as lup. And once this ventricles goes to the resting position, before entering the resting position, closure of semilunar valves takes place, that is pulmonary arteries and the valves that are associated with the pulmonary arteries and aortic branch, and this closure creates the second sound, that is called as duck. Here, so lup has less intensity. If you go with intensity, and it is a time period, you can see that the intensity of this lup sound is less, but the time period is more, which is around 0.15 seconds. The intensity is less, whereas time period is more. Whereas in case of duck, time taking is very less, but the intensity is more. Which is around 0.1 second. So that's the difference between the lup sound and duck sound.